There was a small suburban neighborhood where every lawn looked perfectly trimmed, every mailbox stood painted in identical colors, and every driveway carried a car that matched the community's polished image. At first glance, it looked like the kind of place where nothing unusual could happen, where rules held people together and where order meant peace. But beneath the surface, it was a place run by control, where an HOA board decided how residents lived, and where small joys often clashed with strict regulations. At the edge of this neatly controlled community stood a small, historic church. It had been there long before the HOA existed, long before developers carved the neighborhood into lots and filled it with cookie-cutter homes. The church had stood quietly for over a century, with its red bricks weathered by time, its tall steeple stretching toward the sky, and its bells that rang faithfully at noon and evening. The bells weren't loud, they weren't intrusive. They were a gentle reminder of community, of time passing, and of the traditions that had always bound neighbors together. For decades, those bells brought comfort. Elderly residents paused to hear them. Children walking home from school smiled when they echoed. Families leaving Sunday service took pride in the sound as it drifted across the neighborhood. It was tradition, a piece of history preserved amid modern uniformity. No one thought to question them. No one found fault in their simple chimes, until the HOA decided it was time to interfere. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter slipped under the church door. It was not a friendly request, nor a polite inquiry. It was a citation, an official notice that the sound of the bells violated noise restrictions within the neighborhood. The letter was cold, stamped with the HOA's seal, and accompanied by a threat of fines if the church failed to comply. It demanded that the bells cease immediately, calling them unnecessary disturbances and unapproved sound devices. The congregation was stunned. The bells had been part of the church for generations, long before the HOA board even existed. They were not an addition, not some new experiment, but a tradition that defined the community's very identity. Yet here was a board of homeowners, sitting in their comfortable houses, deciding that a century of history was suddenly too loud. The pastor, a man of patience and calm, read the notice again and again, searching for sense in the words. But there was none. This wasn't about noise. This was about control. The HOA had found something they could target, and they seized the opportunity. What began as a tradition now became a battle. Fines started small, listed at $50 per violation, but the fines grew quickly, escalating with every day the bells rang. Within a week, the church faced hundreds of dollars in penalties, with threats that the amount would increase unless immediate action was taken. The board claimed they had complaints from residents who found the bells disruptive, though no names were given and no evidence was shared. The faceless accusations felt manufactured, designed to justify their actions. Whispers spread through the neighborhood. Some residents quietly supported the church, believing the bells should remain. Others feared crossing the HOA and stayed silent, unwilling to risk being targeted next. And then there were those who sided with the board, parroting their words about community standards and peaceful environments, ignoring the history that gave the neighborhood character. But for the church, the fines cut deep. It was not a wealthy congregation. Donations paid for basic upkeep, for electricity, for small repairs. The sudden financial strain felt like a direct attack, a way to push them into silence by force. Yet the pastor and his congregation were not ready to bow. The bells continued to ring, defiantly marking the hours even as fines stacked higher. To silence them would mean surrendering to an authority that had no rightful claim. What the HOA underestimated was the meaning those bells carried. To them, it was just noise, something that didn't fit neatly within their narrow rules. But to the congregation, it was faith made audible. It was memory, resilience, and identity. Taking away the bells would mean erasing something sacred. The standoff grew tense. HOA board members began to visit in person, standing outside the church, with clipboards, glaring as the bells rang overhead. Their presence was intimidating, a warning that resistance would only bring more punishment. They spoke not with compassion, but with authority, insisting that rules were rules and that no one stood above them, not even a century-old church. But while the HOA tightened its grip, something unexpected began to stir within the community. People who rarely spoke about faith, who rarely even noticed the bells before, began to feel a new appreciation for them. The idea that an HOA could erase history struck a nerve. It wasn't just about religion anymore. It was about identity, about the right to preserve something meaningful against unnecessary control. The pastor could see the shift. Neighbors who once walked past the church without a thought began stopping to listen to the bells. Some residents left small donations to help with fines. Others spoke up quietly, sharing their frustration with the HOA's overreach. A community that had been silent was beginning to find its voice. The HOA believed fines and intimidation would bring compliance. Instead, their tactics awakened something stronger: defiance. The bells rang louder in the minds of those who heard them, becoming a symbol of freedom against control. What was once routine now carried weight, every chime echoing with resistance. But the HOA was not done. They had power, money, and authority on their side. They weren't simply going to allow defiance to continue unchecked. As the conflict escalated, the board began preparing a more aggressive move, one that went beyond fines and into territory far more dangerous for the church. The pastor knew the storm was only beginning. The HOA was determined to silence the bells, and the congregation would need more than tradition to fight back. They would need strength, unity, and a willingness to face whatever came next. And as the bells rang once more at the close of the day, their sound carried across the neighborhood, reminding everyone that this was no longer just about noise. It was about who truly held power in their community. The battle lines had been drawn. The church bells kept ringing, and with each chime, the battle between tradition and authority deepened. What began as letters and fines was no longer enough for the HOA. They had expected quick compliance, a quiet surrender, but instead they found resistance. To the board, this resistance was not just defiance, it was an insult to their power, and they were determined to crush it. The HOA board called a special meeting, one not open to the general public, but held behind closed doors in a private home. The agenda was clear: how to make the church submit. On paper, the HOA had no real authority over the church, since the building predated the neighborhood itself. But the board was not concerned with fairness or legality. They believed that if they pushed hard enough, if they buried the church under pressure, eventually it would break. Their strategy shifted from simple fines to aggressive enforcement. Overnight, the church was flooded with notices claiming violations, beyond the bells. Suddenly, the paint on the church doors was deemed faded and unsightly. The grass around the property was called inconsistent with community standards. Even the church's sign, a simple wooden board announcing Sunday service times, was labeled unauthorized signage. Each notice came with a fine attached, each fine stacking higher with every passing day. It was a campaign of harassment disguised as rule enforcement. The HOA wasn't targeting noise anymore, they were targeting existence. If they couldn't silence the bells directly, they would bleed the church financially until there was nothing left. The pastor gathered the congregation to explain what was happening. Fear hung in the room as he read the letters one by one, each word colder than the last. Some members trembled at the thought of losing their place of worship, their sanctuary that had stood for generations. Others clenched their fists in anger, furious that a group of neighbors could wield such cruelty. The reality was grim. The church's budget, already stretched thin, could not survive the avalanche of penalties. Donations increased as members gave what little they could, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with a single bucket. The HOA seemed endless in its attacks, always finding new violations to tack on. Whispers of deeper intimidation soon spread. Board members were seen approaching individual congregation members outside their homes, warning them about supporting a rule breaker. Some residents who had once spoken up in defense of the church went silent after these encounters, their courage stolen by threats of fines on their own properties. The HOA was tightening its grip, and fear became their weapon. But the church was not entirely alone. Some neighbors, angered by the board's behavior, began quietly documenting everything. They took photographs of board members standing outside the church during bell ringing. They saved copies of the notices, comparing the language, noting how absurd the claims were. They spoke softly, but they were listening, watching, preparing. Meanwhile, the HOA escalated its campaign in a more public way. They sent out newsletters to all residents declaring the church a nuisance to community peace and accusing it of violating noise ordinances that did not even exist in city law. The board framed the conflict not as control but as protection, painting the church as unreasonable and stubborn. It was a battle for public opinion, and the HOA wanted to turn every neighbor against the bells. The pastor, weary but determined, refused to respond with anger. Instead, he continued service as always, reminding his congregation that faith was not measured by ease, but by endurance. And each time the bells rang, he felt their sound carried more than tradition now. It carried defiance, courage, and the weight of a community under attack. But the HOA was not satisfied with fines and propaganda. They decided to take their fight further, stepping into legal territory. They hired an attorney, using association funds to draft a lawsuit against the church. The claim was bold. The bells were a violation of community covenants and created a public nuisance. If successful, the lawsuit could impose an injunction forcing the church to silence the bells permanently, backed by the power of the court. News of the lawsuit shook the congregation. Legal battles meant costs far beyond what fines had already inflicted. Lawyers, court fees, endless paperwork. It was overwhelming for a small church with limited means. The HOA, however, had money and resources. They believed the law was theirs to wield, and they were prepared to drag the church into a fight it couldn't afford. But something unexpected began to happen as word of the lawsuit spread beyond the neighborhood. Local residents outside the HOA's boundaries heard about the conflict. People who had grown up listening to those bells, who had moved away but still remembered them fondly, began speaking out. They saw the fight for what it was. A battle of control versus tradition, power versus heritage. Letters of support arrived at the church. Small donations trickled in from outside the neighborhood. Journalists began asking questions, curious why. A suburban HOA was trying to silence century-old church bells. The HOA's attempt to frame the church as a nuisance was starting to backfire, drawing attention they never wanted. The pastor knew the fight was only beginning, but he could sense a shift. The HOA had power, but power fueled by arrogance often overreached. By pushing too hard, too fast, they were exposing themselves. The lawsuit, instead of silencing the bells, was bringing the conflict into the public eye, where their tactics could no longer hide behind closed doors and newsletters. Still, the weight of uncertainty hung over the congregation. The fines were already draining their funds. The lawsuit promised to drain even more. The future of the church felt fragile, balanced on a knife's edge. Every ring of the bell was a victory, but it was also a reminder that the fight was not yet won. As the evening bells tolled once more, the sound carried across the rooftops of the neighborhood. To some, it was defiance. To others, it was hope. And to the HOA board, it was a challenge they refused to let stand. The battle had escalated from fines to lawsuits, from intimidation to public spectacle. The lines were sharper, the stakes higher. The bells were not just ringing, they were roaring into a storm that would soon engulf the entire community. The HOA thought they were tightening control, but what they didn't realize was that every move they made was planting the seeds of their own downfall. The lawsuit changed everything. What had once been a quiet standoff between the church and the HOA now spilled into every corner of the neighborhood. People could no longer ignore the conflict, no longer pretend it was just a matter of rules and compliance. Everyone was forced to take a side. Some residents aligned themselves firmly with the HOA, echoing the board's words about peace and quiet. They claimed the church bells were disruptive, that modern living didn't need such traditions. To them, the sound was not history but inconvenience. They insisted that community standards mattered more than old customs, and they treated the lawsuit as necessary for order. Others saw through the board's language. They recognized that the HOA's obsession wasn't about peace, but about control. They knew the church had stood long before the neighborhood existed, and they resented the idea of a board trying to erase a century of history. To them, the bells were harmless, even beautiful, and the fight to silence them felt like an attack on freedom. The division was sharp and bitter. Neighbors who had once greeted each other on morning walks now avoided eye contact. Friendly conversations turned into arguments. Fence lines became invisible battle lines, with each side whispering about the other. The HOA fueled the divide with calculated precision. In their newsletters, they painted supporters of the church as troublemakers, unwilling to respect rules. They warned residents that if the church was allowed to ignore noise restrictions, others might soon ignore landscaping guidelines or parking rules. They framed the lawsuit as protection for everyone, as if silencing the bells would save the neighborhood from chaos. But the church's defenders refused to back down. They pointed out that the bells had never been a problem until the HOA decided they were. They reminded people that the church predated the neighborhood itself, that its traditions were part of the area's identity. They organized small gatherings, quietly encouraging each other to stand strong, even as threats of fines loomed for those who spoke too loudly. The pressure was immense. Families found themselves split, some parents siding with the HOA, while their children whispered support for the church. Couples argued late into the night, torn between fear of fines and frustration at injustice. The conflict wasn't just on paper anymore. It lived in the very air of the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the church itself became a symbol larger than the bells. Journalists began to cover the story more closely, capturing the tension that had divided the community. Local. News stations aired clips of the steeple against the sky, the sound of bells ringing as background to their reports. Viewers across the city watched, shaking their heads at how far an HOA was willing to go for control. The increased attention rattled the HOA. They thrived in secrecy, behind closed meetings and quiet enforcement, but now their actions were being scrutinized. Board members were confronted in public spaces by reporters with cameras, their polished statements suddenly sounding defensive. Instead of controlling the narrative, they were being forced to explain why a neighborhood association was suing a historic church. Some board members began to show cracks. They hadn't anticipated this level of attention, nor the backlash that came with it. But the president of the HOA, a woman known for her sharp tongue and relentless enforcement of rules, refused to waver. To her, this was a battle of pride. If the church won, it meant the board's authority could be questioned. And in her mind, nothing was worse than losing control. The congregation, meanwhile, leaned on faith and solidarity. Sunday services grew fuller, not emptier, as word spread about their struggle. People who hadn't attended in years returned, drawn by the sense of unity. Some residents from outside the neighborhood even joined, adding their voices to the growing support. Each time the bells rang, applause sometimes followed, echoing the spirit of defiance against the HOA's grip. Yet the pressure weighed heavily on those caught in between. Some neighbors supported the church quietly but feared retaliation. From the HOA, they worried about fines, about being singled out. Others supported the HOA but grew uncomfortable with the hostility it created. The community was fraying, and trust among neighbors was collapsing. Tensions boiled over in small but telling ways. Notes appeared on mailboxes, some praising the church, others condemning it. Social media pages for the neighborhood filled with heated arguments, accusations, and bitter exchanges. Residents began recording each other during disputes, hoping to capture evidence to use against their opponents. The lawsuit hearings loomed closer, and the weight of the conflict pressed down harder each day. The pastor, though calm in demeanor, felt the strain as he balanced faith with the practical needs of survival. The fines continued to drain the church's limited resources, and legal costs piled on top. Every donation helped, but it was still like fighting a giant with bare hands. Yet through it all, the bells continued to ring. They became more than sound. They became a declaration. Every chime reminded the neighborhood of the battle, forcing them to confront the conflict. For some, it was defiance. For others, it was defilement. But for everyone, it was impossible to ignore. The HOA board prepared its case with cold determination. They gathered fabricated complaints, exaggerated claims of noise disruption, and expert opinions designed to sway the court. They believed that once a judge ruled in their favor, the church would have no choice but to silence the bells forever. But the congregation had its own allies. Lawyers sympathetic to their cause began offering help at reduced fees. Community members outside the HOA began organizing fundraisers. Support came in small amounts, but it was steady, each act of kindness fueling the resistance. The stage was set for a confrontation larger than anyone expected. What started as fines had grown into a legal battle that drew attention far beyond the neighborhood streets. The community was fractured, with every household forced to pick a side. The bells had become a wedge, splitting friends and families, yet also binding strangers together in unexpected unity. As the lawsuit date drew near, both sides prepared for war. The HOA believed it had law and order on its side. The church believed it had faith and justice. The community, once quiet and orderly, now stood on the edge of something far greater than property rules. The evening bells rang again, echoing across the divided neighborhood. For some, it was a warning. For others, it was hope. And for everyone, it was a reminder that silence was not easily won. The fight was no longer about noise. It was about who controlled the soul of the community. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm cloud over the neighborhood. For weeks, the bells had rung defiantly while the HOA sharpened its legal weapons. Now the conflict was moving beyond letters, fines, and newsletters into the stark, unforgiving walls of a courtroom. The courthouse stood tall, indifferent to the small war that had consumed one suburban community. For the judge, it was just another case in a long docket. But for the church and the HOA, it was everything. It was authority on trial. It was history versus control. The HOA came prepared with polished attorneys, their suits crisp, their voices confident. They carried binders filled with documents, complaint letters, and manufactured evidence. They presented themselves as the voice of reason, the guardians of peace, framing the church as stubborn rule breakers clinging to outdated traditions. They argued that the bells disturbed the quiet enjoyment of residents, citing supposed sleepless nights, disrupted work-from-home routines, and complaints from those who claimed they couldn't concentrate with the sound echoing through the air. Their lawyer painted a picture of a neighborhood suffering under constant noise, as though the church bells rang endlessly day and night rather than only twice a day. The congregation sat silently, listening as their place of worship was reduced to a nuisance in legal language. The pastor's face was calm, but his heart was heavy. The narrative twisted the truth, turning something beloved into something vilified. It was painful, but not surprising. Then it was the church's turn. Their attorney, a man who had grown up in the same town, stood with far less polish, but far more conviction. He reminded the court that the church had existed for over a century, long before the HOA was formed. He pointed out that the bells were not a new addition but an established tradition, woven into the community's history. He noted that there were no city ordinances restricting such sounds and that the HOA's authority stopped at the property line of its members. He produced evidence of support letters, testimonials from residents who cherished the bells, and statements from locals who had never once considered them disruptive. He reminded the court that freedom of expression and religious tradition were protected, and that silencing the bells was not about peace, but about power. The judge listened, unmoved by dramatics, but sharp in attention. He asked pointed questions. Why did the HOA wait so long to claim the bells were a problem if they had rung for decades? Why had fines expanded into unrelated violations about paint and grass? Where was the documented proof of complaints beyond vague claims? Each question struck at the heart of the HOA's case, exposing cracks beneath their polished presentation. The tension in the room grew heavy. The HOA board members sat stiffly, their confidence shaken by the judge's skepticism. Their attorney tried to recover, presenting charts and decibel readings, but the numbers failed to match their exaggerated claims. The church's lawyer countered with expert testimony showing that the bell's sound fell well within acceptable limits, no louder than a passing car or a lawnmower, noises the HOA never fined anyone for. The courtroom battle stretched on for hours, each side pressing hard. The congregation prayed quietly in their seats while HOA supporters whispered among themselves, restless with the way the tide seemed to be shifting. By the end of the day, the judge did not deliver a final ruling. Instead, he announced he would review all evidence and issue his decision at a later date. The gavel struck and the room emptied, but the war was far from over. Both sides left the courthouse with their pride wounded and their determination burning hotter. For the church, there was relief. They had survived the onslaught, their tradition defended with truth and reason. They knew the judge's questions had cut deep into the HOA's arguments, but they also knew the HOA would not surrender easily. Win or lose, the board's president was not the type to let go of control without a fight. Back in the neighborhood, the courtroom battle only deepened the division. Supporters of the church celebrated, convinced the judge had seen through the lies. Supporters of the HOA seethed, insisting the board was right and that outsiders didn't understand the importance of rules. The conflict spilled into streets and sidewalks, into whispered conversations and heated arguments. The HOA board doubled down on their campaign. They flooded the community with newsletters filled with warnings of anarchy if the church won. They reminded residents that if the church ignored rules, anyone could. They threatened stricter enforcement of every regulation, making life miserable for homeowners caught in the crossfire. Driveways were measured, lawns inspected, fences scrutinized. The board flexed its power like a clenched fist. But their desperation revealed something else: fear. The lawsuit had not gone the way they expected. The board had believed the courtroom would deliver a swift victory, a legal stamp of authority. Instead, their tactics were exposed, their credibility shaken. The more they pressed, the more the neighborhood began to see their actions for what they truly were: not protection, but control. The church, meanwhile, found strength in the struggle. Attendance grew larger with each Sunday. Donations increased, as people from outside the neighborhood, inspired by the story, offered their support. The bells became more symbolic than ever, a sound of defiance, of unity, of endurance against tyranny. Every time they rang, the sound seemed to carry further. It was no longer just a neighborhood issue. It was a message spreading across the city. The HOA had tried to silence faith, but instead they had amplified it. The board president, however, was relentless. She vowed privately that she would not stop until the bells were gone, no matter the cost. She saw the courtroom setback not as defeat, but as insult, and her determination hardened into obsession. The lawsuit's outcome still loomed, and with it, the future of the bells. But the fight was no longer confined to legal papers and fines. It had become a battle for hearts and minds, a struggle between community identity and authoritarian control. And as the sun set that evening, the bells rang once more. Their sound echoed across streets divided, across neighbors turned against each other, across a board clinging to power and a congregation refusing to yield. The courtroom had not silenced them. The HOA's fines had not silenced them. Their sound grew louder, in defiance, louder in meaning. The battle was not over. It was only entering its next stage. The courtroom battle should have been a moment for reflection, but for the HOA's president, it was a spark that ignited obsession. She had spent years ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist, enforcing rules down to the smallest detail, and now her authority had been publicly questioned. To her, this was more than a legal dispute over bells. It was a test of control, a challenge to her dominance, and she was determined not to lose. She began calling emergency board meetings at all hours, pushing her fellow members harder than ever. What had once been a collective of volunteers trying to manage community affairs now became a weapon for her personal vendetta. Any hesitation from board members was met with sharp words, accusations of disloyalty, and reminders that the future of the neighborhood depended on obedience. One by one, dissenting voices fell silent, replaced by uneasy compliance. Her obsession spilled into every aspect of HOA life. Neighbors who had never been targeted before suddenly found notices on their doors. Lawns were measured with rulers, paint colors questioned, vehicles cited for the smallest imperfections. It was as if the entire neighborhood had become collateral damage in her war against the church. If residents felt the pain of stricter enforcement, she believed, they would turn their anger toward the real troublemaker, the bells. But her tactics had the opposite effect. Instead of dividing the community further, her overreach began to unite people against her. Families whispered about the absurdity of being fined for a flower bed that extended an inch too far. Elderly residents muttered about harassment when warned that their porch chairs were unapproved furniture. The board president's crusade against the church was spilling into everyone's lives, and neighbors who had once ignored the conflict now found themselves dragged into it. The neighborhood grew tense. Conversations turned into venting sessions, with residents sharing stories of unfair treatment. Some who had once supported the HOA began questioning their loyalty, realizing the rules they had trusted were being weaponized. The president's grip was tightening, but with it, resentment swelled. Meanwhile, the church became a refuge from the storm. As the HOA's intimidation spread, more neighbors slipped quietly into Sunday services. Some came for faith, others simply for comfort, but all found solace in the steady rhythm of tradition. The bells that had once divided the community now began to draw it together. Their sound became not just defiance, but a rallying cry. The media coverage only intensified. Reporters captured the growing unease, broadcasting stories of residents fined for trivial reasons, of intimidation tactics that bordered on harassment. Headlines shifted from church versus HOA to neighborhood in turmoil. The board president, once hidden behind her authority, found herself under a spotlight she could not control. But instead of retreating, she pushed harder. She hired private security to patrol the neighborhood under the guise of safety, though their presence felt more like surveillance. Residents reported being followed on walks, questioned about visitors, even photographed in their own driveways. It was intimidation cloaked in professionalism, and it only deepened the fear and resentment. The church, however, did not flinch. The pastor continued to hold services, reminding his congregation that their struggle was not about anger, but endurance. Each toll of the bell carried that message, ringing across the rooftops like a challenge the HOA could not silence. Behind closed doors, cracks within the board widened. Some members, exhausted by the president's demands, began quietly leaking information. They shared documents with residents, exposing how funds were being drained for legal fees, how resources meant for community upkeep were instead being funneled into the fight against the church. The leaks spread quickly, whispered from household to household, fueling outrage. The residents began organizing. Small meetings formed in living rooms, far from the board's reach. Neighbors who had once been strangers sat together, united by frustration. They discussed petitions, recalls, and legal avenues to challenge the HOA's authority. What had once seemed impossible, standing up to the board, now seemed inevitable. The president sensed the shift, and her obsession grew darker. She sent letters warning residents not to engage in unauthorized gatherings. She accused those questioning the board of inciting division. But her words rang hollow, her authority cracked by her own overreach. Each threat only pushed more neighbors into resistance. The congregation, once isolated in their struggle, now felt the weight of the community moving toward them. Where once they stood alone, they now had allies. The sound of the bells no longer symbolized only faith. It symbolized resistance against control. The HOA president, however, was not done. In her mind, the battle had become personal, and she would not allow herself to be humiliated. She began plotting one final move, one last strike to break the church completely. It would not be fines or letters or lawsuits this time. It would be something far more drastic. The neighborhood braced unknowingly, caught in the tightening grip of her obsession. Tension filled the air, thick as storm clouds. Every resident could feel it. Something was coming, something bigger than fines or newsletters. And as the bells rang that evening, their sound carried a warning, echoing across the streets with haunting clarity. The battle was reaching its breaking point. The HOA president's obsession had spiraled past the point of reason. The fines, the intimidation, the lawsuit, none of it had silenced the bells. Instead, each move had fueled defiance, strengthening the very thing she sought to destroy. But in her mind, surrender was not an option. Pride had overtaken judgment, and she was ready to make her final, desperate move. One quiet morning, the neighborhood woke to the sight of trucks idling near the church. Workers in reflective vests unloaded ladders, hammers, and equipment. They claimed they were authorized by the board to remove the bell system, citing it as hazardous and structurally unsafe. It was not maintenance, it was an attempt to erase history by force. But the plan did not go unnoticed. Residents gathered quickly, some alerted by the noise of the trucks, others by frantic phone calls. Within minutes, a crowd formed at the church steps. The congregation arrived, their faces filled with disbelief, standing shoulder to shoulder against the workers. Tension crackled in the air as the board president appeared, clipboard in hand, ordering the workers to proceed. Her voice carried authority, but her words carried no legitimacy. The church was not HOA property. She had no jurisdiction, no right to interfere. What she had instead was arrogance, and that arrogance had finally gone too far. The scene unfolded in chaos. Cameras appeared, both from neighbors and local journalists who had been following the story. They filmed as the president argued with residents, her voice shrill, her composure cracking. The workers hesitated, unsure of their orders as the crowd grew louder, demanding they leave. It was the moment the community had been waiting for. The whispers of resistance, the quiet meetings, the growing frustration, it all erupted in open defiance. Residents who had once stayed silent now shouted their anger, exposing the president's abuse of power for all to see. Her intimidation no longer worked. The fear she had built her control upon dissolved in the face of unity. Law enforcement was called. Officers arrived to restore order, but when they examined the situation, the truth became clear. The HOA had no authority to order the removal of the bells. The trucks, the workers, the attempted destruction, it was all unlawful. The president's final move was not only desperate, but reckless. The officers ordered the workers to leave immediately. The trucks rolled away, the ladders unused, leaving the church untouched. And in that moment, the president's power crumbled. Her authority, once unquestioned, was now publicly exposed as empty. The community had witnessed her overreach, and there was no going back. What followed was swift. Petitions circulated calling for her removal. Residents who had once feared retaliation now stood boldly, signing their names, demanding accountability. The board fractured, members resigning rather than sinking with her obsession. Meetings once dominated by her voice became battlegrounds for her removal. The final blow came not from anger but from law. Investigations into HOA funds revealed the truth. Thousands of dollars drained from community accounts to fuel her personal vendetta against the church. Legal fees, private security, intimidation campaigns, all paid for with money meant for neighborhood upkeep. The discovery sealed her fate. She was ousted from the board, stripped of her position, and left disgraced. The neighborhood, though, scarred by division, began to heal. Without her control, residents found their voices again. New leadership rose, focused not on power but on restoring trust. Rules still existed, but they were enforced with fairness, not weaponized for control. The community learned a painful lesson. Authority unchecked could consume everything, but unity could overcome it. And the church? The bells continued to ring. They rang not just as tradition, but as victory. Each chime carried the weight of what had been endured. The fines, the lawsuits, the intimidation, the attempted destruction. They rang as a reminder that faith, history, and community could not be silenced by arrogance. For the congregation, the sound was sweeter than ever. For the neighborhood, it became a symbol of resilience. What had once divided them now united. Them, the bells standing not as noise but as the heartbeat of their shared story. The fall of the HOA president became a cautionary tale, whispered long after she was gone. Residents remembered her not as a leader, but as a warning of what happens when power becomes obsession. The church, however, was remembered for endurance, for standing firm when surrender would have been easier. And so, as the sun set over the quiet streets, the bells tolled once more. Their sound drifted across rooftops and gardens, across families gathered on porches and children playing in yards. It was not disruption. It was not nuisance. It was the sound of freedom, of victory, of a community reclaimed. The HOA had tried to silence faith, but in the end, it was faith that silenced them.